I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Today I'm going to talk to you about the mechanics, the modus operandi of the whole Strzok, Page, Comey, McCabe effort to go after President Trump. You've seen the text messages. You understand that there was this concerted effort to get Trump. In fact, Strzok goes so far as to put in a text message to his girlfriend, Lisa Page, that we're going to stop him. So how did they do that? What was the technique that they used? And why did they use the approach that they did to get to the point where they could gin up this whole, really, witch hunt that the president refers to that's now resulted in the Mueller investigation? Okay, so there's this decision that Trump is unacceptable, that he must be stopped. And it begins with his candidacy, continues through his transition, and then into his presidency. What was the technique that was used? How did they use it? Why did they use the approach that they did, using a counterintelligence investigation as the means to really smear the president and the circle of people around him? So this is a little bit of a history lesson here, and that'll provide context as to why they did what they did. There's an executive order called EO 12333, 12333, and that executive order goes all the way back to the 1980s, and it governs intelligence operations. Within that executive order, there's a section called 209. Now, I know that some of you, your eyes are glazing over because I'm discussing a paragraph in an executive order, but bear with me. The section 209 talks about undisclosed participation in U.S. organizations in the United States. Why does that matter? Well, what the Strzok, Page, Comey crowd, that litany of about at least a dozen folks who've either been fired, resigned, retired, or left, the entire leadership essentially of the FBI, those folks were targeting the president, or at the time, candidate Trump. They were going to try to use a counterintelligence investigation as the ruse, as the backdrop for all their efforts to destroy the man personally, but his campaign and his presidency. That executive order, 12333, section 209, concerning undisclosed participation in U.S. organizations in the United States, that section of the law, essentially, prohibits the FBI, law enforcement and intelligence services from running a penetration operation against a political campaign. This goes all the way back to 1968, when the FBI convinced Army counterintelligence to run a penetration operation against Students for Democratic Society, SDS, a radical militant student group. It wasn't just students, it was a lot of other sort of fellow travelers who engaged in all sorts of really terrorism. They blew up post offices, they took over campus facilities, they made threats, they had non-negotiable demands. There was all sorts of turmoil in 1968. The unfortunate sort of intelligence hangover from that was that in hindsight, people said, hey, what is Army counterintelligence doing penetrating a US student-based political movement? And there are repercussions, and this goes all the way back, again to the 1960s. But the takeaway from that was this prohibition put in an executive order saying that law enforcement and intelligence services cannot run penetration operations against US organizations in the United States. And so now you have the FBI, Department of Justice, you can even stretch out over to Mr. Brennan, who is sitting at the CIA, those law enforcement and intelligence service persons looking to target a political campaign, and then subsequently, of course, a presidency. So how do they do that legally? And I use legally advisedly because their actions were unlawful. But what was the pretext? What was the vehicle, the mechanism to get them to be able to do that? So here's how you unwind the story. You will recall that sort of the predicate for an awful lot of these activities going after Mr. Trump hinge on a supposed counterintelligence investigation that is related to Carter Page and Mr. Papadopoulos and others. The effort to go after them was very craftily put together to be in accordance with the executive order and the prohibition on these penetration operations or undisclosed participation. So there's two ways to engage in undisclosed participation. One is to have an attorney general letter. So in that case, the conspirators, and I'll just call them that, the Strzok, Page, Comey, McCabe, DOJ, FBI leadership, the conspirators were not going to rely on drafting up a proposal, a counterintelligence operational concept, and getting it in front of the Attorney General to have Loretta Lynch sign off on it. There's a few reasons for that. Number one, I don't think that they could trust her. I don't think that they were necessarily comfortable in whether she would be on board. Number two, it would create a horrendous paper trail for them. It would show that they had this predisposition to go after a candidate and then subsequently a president under this idea that, oh, we need to target them. We need to run a penetration operation against them. So they're not entirely happy with the Loretta Lynch Attorney General letter option for those reasons and others. So how do you get around this? How do you break the code on this? Well, they very creatively, very craftily decided to launch a counterintelligence incident or event overseas. Because if there's a situation or event that occurs overseas, the FBI can then sort of frame themselves as being reactive. They're responding to an outside threat. And so they set up this situation where Carter Page, Papadopoulos are approached in the United Kingdom by persons that are sort of either soliciting or attempting to engage them or asking questions or in some way trying to enmesh them in something that appears to be a counterintelligence event that would require an investigation. Once that occurs, once you have that sort of proximate cause or that ignition point overseas, you can then import the investigation back into the United States. You don't require anybody's approval, no Attorney General letter, no offensive effort initiated domestically. This is all reactive. And so it's sort of a laundering operation. They take their intent, their goal and objective, and they can't do it domestically. So they start it as a foreign counterintelligence reportable event. Then say, oh no, look at the problem we have. They import it back into the United States and then launch their entire program, their project. And they do so using people like Papadopoulos and Carter Page because frankly, it's easy to use them. They're relatively low-hanging fruit. And the advantage of having this foreign counterintelligence event then imported into the United States is that it obviates the prohibition on undisclosed participation in U.S. organizations in the United States. They have their in. They use this phonied up event that they themselves manufactured and then brought back into the United States as the foundation for getting FISA warrants. They knew the FISA warrants, the applications themselves were false, yet they went ahead and renewed them 3 times over. It was the starting point. It was their foot in the door. And so when you look at the entire witch hunt, a lot comes from this. Not only do you have the efforts to go after Carter Page, Papadopoulos, and then others within President Trump's circle, and frankly, Papadopoulos and Page were not in the president's circle. Papadopoulos is a relatively low-ranking staffer who really didn't have much impact on the campaign. Carter Page was a self-appointed volunteer. He held no office. He didn't have, a phone number or business card. He had no official position. Here's a guy who sort of self-designated himself, as a volunteer on foreign policy matters, but he actually did not hold any position with the campaign. Now, he isn't presented that way. He isn't talked about that way. He's presented or he's sort of framed up or painted as being a foreign policy advisor to Mr. Trump. Well, it doesn't pass very much scrutiny. He had only the most remote connection. But nonetheless, it was low enough and enough of a connection to be able to have a lot of arm waving by the FBI and Department of Justice saying, see, this person's connected to the campaign and we have to investigate because we need more information. And how would we know? See, you kind of use the lack of information as the excuse to get more information. And that's how they got FISA warrants and that's how they renewed them. Because really the minimization procedures with respect to the FISA court itself and where the FISA application, where the warrants themselves can go, allows the FBI and Department of Justice not just to look at Mr. Page, but those persons who are in contact with Mr. Page, and then those persons who are in contact with those persons. It kind of goes out 2 levels beyond that. So it's a convoluted tale. It is not necessarily a clean, easy explanation to understand how they manufactured this phony investigation. But it's important to understand that there were internal procedures that the FBI and Department of Justice were following in an effort to legitimize or to make their campaign against the Trump campaign look legal, to look regular, to look normal. All the sort of layers of the onion are peeling away with respect to this investigation. People are becoming a lot more aware and savvy with respect to not just these persons' motivations and their political bias, which has now been well documented, but that pre-existing idea that, stop Trump, this explains to you why and how they did what they did. It isn't sufficient to just keep asking the question, what? Because all we do is sort of chase headlines that way. You have to understand why. Why did they do what they did? And how did they do it? And so understanding this executive order and the prohibition, Section 2.9, on undisclosed participation in U.S. organizations in the United States is critical because it shows you the modus operandi. It shows you how these people went about constructing this phony investigation, this false narrative, in an effort to smear the president and to undermine his presidency. It's kind of a backstory. It isn't necessarily something that's discussed very much. Everyone just kind of jumps from one headline to the next. But I think it's important for context, for all of you to understand the technique. How did they do what they did? Why did they choose those people? Why did they choose the process that they did? How did they take a foreign counterintelligence event overseas that they manufactured, bring it back into the United States as an ongoing investigation, and then run with it from there? And frankly, if there was that much of a foreign counterintelligence threat, ask yourself, why was Mr. Trump and his inner circle, his legitimate inner circle from his campaign, why were they never given a defensive security briefing? Normally in these instances, law enforcement or intelligence services will go to the principals involved, whether it's an American corporation, whether it's a business or a businessman who's involved with foreign actors, and they'll say to them, hey, look, you may have a problem. You may need to be aware that there are persons who are trying to influence or penetrate your organization. That never occurred. Why? If they really believed that there was a sincere threat on the part of the Russians, or for that matter, any other foreign power, to in some way manipulate, influence, monkey around with, or in some way do something to affect the legitimacy of the outcome of an election, the FBI and Department of Justice had an affirmative obligation to tell the principals that were involved, hey, look, we're concerned, and here's why. You need to look out for the following things. Never happened. How can that be? If it's such a grave threat, if there's such concern, if there's such a big elaborate investigation going on, why wouldn't they ever tell the person involved? And if the assumption is, well, that's because Mr. Trump was the target, he was the bad guy, why is there no evidence that any sort of FISA warrant was actually obtained on Mr. Trump personally? If he's the threat, if they're concerned about all sorts of collusion, whatever that means, or some sort of conspiracy, well then why not target the principal? Why not find the subject of the investigation and go after him? You don't see that. What you see is sort of second and third tier level people who have arguably minimal connection to the actual campaign itself, certainly not to Mr. Trump, but they go after them, and they use this pretty obscure, arcane technique in an effort to circumvent the existing law, but create enough fury and smoke to make people think, hey, wait a minute, maybe something is going on, maybe this is real, and it isn't. And so as time goes along, Judicial Watch will continue to sort of peel back the layers of the onion. We'll continue to get documents. We'll continue to pursue our own investigations so that we can come to you like this and explain to you, how did this all happen? Who was involved? What did they do? How did they do it? And most importantly, why? I'm Chris Farrell on Watch.